You want to solve police brutality? Solve the Supreme Court. We vote for our Congress, we vote for the President of the United States, and we have an unelected body of Supreme Court people who decide the laws in our country. These green lines here is where Congress gives us laws that gives us rights. These cases here, the Supreme Court took our rights away. The results? Thousands of lynchings for decades, almost 100 years. We repeat what happened in 1865 to 1870. We get our rights, the Supreme Court takes them away with Terry versus Ohio. This roster of courts, they wanted to make sure your rights couldn't be applied to you. This roster of court, they want to make sure they're the arbitrators of police officer safety. That's the problem in America. It's the Supreme Court. If we don't make the Supreme Court electable, then we're doomed. Tune in June 19th. I'm giving a live dissertation called Legally Departed. My name is Chili DeCastro. Thank you for your time. I'm not just here to complain about police. I'm here to offer solutions. How much do you really know about police? How much do you really know about policing? These are the 3 commissions on policing. The Wickersham was done in 1929, the Knapp in 1972, and the Mullen Commission in 1994. If you haven't read them, you really don't know anything about police or policing. You only know what your friend, your neighbor, your lover, your husband, your brother, your best friend told you about policing. And what I hear all the time is that my brother's a cop and he was a good one. No, he wasn't. He was horrific. Have you read these? If you read these, then you would know that. And these commissions were not ordered by some left-leaning snowflake. These commissions were ordered by Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton, 3 of the most authoritarian presidents in US history. All 3 commissions say the exact same thing. Police are completely lawless, completely ineffective in stopping or preventing crime, and that they're the most corrupt, violent organization America knows. If you have a lover who's a cop, all you know is what they tell you. The founding of our country is set up on checks and balances. I'm recommending that we create 2 new agencies to oversee police that do not connect to police at all. A third-party watchdog agency that has subpoena power, that overlooks district attorneys, government officials, and make sure that all police warrants go through them. A third-party auditing agency that gets all the body cam footage and is on scene to record police the full time that they're involved with any person. This is checks and balances. These are not my ideas. I did not come up with checks and balances. These ideas are by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, and John Locke. Our Constitution is based on the principles of these men's philosophies. We need checks and balances on policing. Tune in on June 19th and I'll explain to you real solutions for police brutality and how to fix the corrupt, tyrannical Supreme Court. Silly me with the logic. How can we have a federal national holiday called Juneteenth when we have 2.5 million people who are still doing slave labor? The 13th Amendment was passed by Abraham Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that freed slaves. Lincoln made a deal with slave owners and said, it'll have 2 lines. It'll say, slavery's abolished unless you're convicted of a crime. Two million people who are slaves in America. And then people out here are gonna celebrate Juneteenth? Is that like having legal marijuana as people are rotting in cages for marijuana? Sorry, I hate to be logical here, but how can you celebrate Juneteenth when we have slaves in America? It's up to young people to change this world. I will be dead by the time you change the world. In a case called Pace versus Alabama in 1883, this criminalized interracial relationships. In 1884, 160 white people were lynched, the most on record by the NAACP. Pace versus Alabama that happened in 1883 was not overturned until 1967 in a case called Loving versus Virginia. You got the ball, Gen Z. You got the ball. You got to make these guys electable. Plessy versus Ferguson passed in 1896, took 58 years to overturn. You will live your lifetime before you see change because Plessy was not overruled until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Gen Z, you got the ball. Are you listening to me? Tyranny is afoot. We didn't elect senators until the 17th Amendment, and now we elect them. We need to make the Supreme Court electable. Gen Z, you got the ball. It's Earl Warren freed blacks on May 17, 1954. in a case called Brown versus Board of Education. Now, you may think of Earl Warren as some great humanitarian. Not at all, not even close. He was a prison state, police state, Freemason who had won every election he'd ever gone out for. And what he did in 1944 in a case called Korematsu versus United States, in 1942, Earl Warren convinced FDR to lock up 100,000 Japanese because of World War II. When Korematsu sued, he lost because FDR had appointed 7 Supreme Court justices, and they said it wasn't racist at all. So, why did Earl Warren desegregate in 1954? Because he was an authoritarian and he had no idea what was going on in the black community. At restaurants, bars, clubs, they still had black establishments, and Earl Warren didn't know what was going on in the schools. What were they saying to the schools? Were they getting the same indoctrination that the white kids are? So Earl Warren desegregated because he's an authoritarian, and so that he could arrest blacks and create the penal system we have today. Earl Warren, I want you to read the 3 police commissions, the 3 commissions on policing. This one is the 1994 Mullen Commission. This one talks about the code of silence, where police won't tell anything about any other cop, and it talks about the Back the Blue slogan that was created by an advertising agency. Because the Mullen Commission was so atrocious and said how horrible police are, that they're completely lawless, they're violent, they're gang members, they're either the head of every organized gang or they're the muscle for the organized gang. That's in the Mullen. The Wickersham Commission came out in 1929, and this is about prohibition, how the police are either, again, the head of the alcohol gang or the gang itself. Olmsted versus United States, I believe, was 1927, and in that case, Roy Olmsted was convicted for bootlegging. He was a Seattle police lieutenant. Have you ever heard about that before? And then this is the Knapp Commission in 1974. This says police are completely lawless. I challenge you to read them. 3 police commissions. If you don't have them, I got them. I want some fascinating things happened as I built the wall and the history of institutional racism in our country. Take a look at the lynching chart. Here's the lynching chart over here. Now, I found more lynchings than the NAACP lists. However, the NAACP starts in 1882 and it ends in about 1965. Can you see the chart? You see it right here? Now, on the other side is the prison chart. The prison chart takes off, guess when? Terry v. Ohio, right there. That's when it takes off. And take a look at the shape of it. Look at the shape of the prison chart. Incredible. If I took a pin and I magically could take a pin and stick it right there on the lynching chart, and I could make it swing around. I could do it in Photoshop. It would be the same shape as the prison chart. It would be the same shape. Do you see that? I didn't do that. Those are just statistics. When the lynchings end, the prison system begins. Some facts. We talked about the lynching chart and how it ends in about 1964, 1965. What happens? How come the lynchings in Alabama come to an end? It was because of a white conservative. This man right here is named Dr. T.C. Donald. He put his name in the Annister Star, along with 200 other white men and a handful of prominent black leaders in the community. And the lynchings came to an end. T.C. Donald said, I'm done with it. I'm gonna put up $20,000 to find out who the killer of Willie Brewster was. They found Darren Strange and they arrested him. Darren Strange was the first white man ever found guilty of killing a black man in America. The very first one. He never served any prison time. He was released on appeal and then shot in the face by his mechanic a few months later in another dispute. He was a real peach. Conservatives. Dr. T.C. Donald put his name in the paper and things changed. If you're going to talk about reparations, you have to be specific to the reasons why reparations are owed. Here's why. In 1926, in a case called Corrigan versus Buckley, the unelected tyrannical Supreme Court upheld racial restrictive covenants. What are the results of that? What that means is that you couldn't sell your house to a black person. As you know, generational wealth is typically handed down through the house in the family. Corrigan versus Buckley, white folks bought houses. Their grandparents passed it down to their kids, down to their kids. It happens again, it repeats about 1950 or so. The kids come back from college, they buy a house. Then they share with their kids. The money from the house transfers to the next generation. Then we get to the 60s and what happens? There's an explosion in America. Because blacks have been cut out of generational wealth, well, since the beginning, but for 4 decades since the Supreme Tyranny passed Corrigan versus Buckley. You have to be specific when you talk about reparations as to the reasons why, and it's Corrigan versus Buckley. The reason there's the term Black Lives Matter is because throughout the history of time, black people dying hasn't really mattered, and it doesn't matter today either. The only time change occurs where we change unjust and unconstitutional laws is when a white person dies, or when a group of white conservatives step up to change things. And a simple example is Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jimmy Lee Jackson was a member of the NAACP, 25 years old, one of the most delightful people I've researched through this long research project I've been doing. And he was killed in broad daylight in a field by a state trooper named James Fowler. And Fowler admitted to killing him in broad daylight. Meanwhile, when James Reeb went down for the second march, Selma Montgomery, front page news. He was on the front page of every single newspaper there was in America. Reeb's been killed. The Princeton-educated minister has been killed. Everybody outraged. The reason there's the term Black Lives Matter, I didn't start off building this wall to explain the history of institutional racism in America. That's just how it ended up. As I studied the laws starting in 1607, going to 2021, what I found out was that the laws were crafted against blacks, Mexicans, Native Americans, and any person of color, including Asians as well. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because 20 years ago, Chief of Police Michael Moore no-knock raided my apartment twice in the same month. It was because of Illinois versus Gates. That's why he could do it. I hired Robert Shapiro and I beat those charges, but it cost me everything. It cost everything. Illinois Gates made it so that they could just investigate me with any information, even though it was false. That superseded Spinelli versus United States, which had a two-prong effect for police where they had to investigate both the information and the confidential informant. So that way one painter across the street couldn't say that painter's bad. That's what happened to me, and that's why I'm here. And what this lays out is the history of institutional racism in our country. I didn't start off. You want to know how you can help me? You can sign up at deletelaws.com. You can sign up at legallydeparted.com. I'll have an ebook on there later tonight. We need 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. As soon as I have 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, I will go on YouTube Live and I'll do a Q&A with everybody on there. That's how you can help me. The ebook has 5 prices: $1.99, $10, $20. This man is named Harry Anslinger. He was a devout racist born in 1896, and he had one goal: to lock up as many black people as he could through marijuana. He criminalized marijuana because of his deep hatred and racism for black people. Well, after he criminalized marijuana in 1937, the marijuana study from LaGuardia, the governor of New York, released. And you know what it says? That marijuana has no character changes. It doesn't affect your personality. The LaGuardia report is full of things like aptitude tests, medical tests, aspiration tests. Do you lose aspiration? Double-blind test, psychological test. The information's 80 years old, still really relevant. It doesn't affect your brain. If you're going through some sort of mental psychosis or having a hard time with life, it's because that's how it's happening. Take a hit of weed, it might actually calm you down. Don't buy the propaganda that Harry Anslinger created in the 30s. Read the LaGuardia report.
Hey there, I'm Officer Madwin. I'm here with Chili. What are my officer's rights over you?
Well, for example, you have Terry v. Ohio.
So if I'm reasonably suspicious...
I have to get on my knees.
Perfect. And I can put you in handcuffs?
Yes.
I can throw you in the car?
Yes.
I can bring you to prison?
Yes.
I can rough you up a little bit?
All the time.
Perfect. Awesome. I want to drag you out of a car.
Oh, that's Pennsylvania versus Mims right here. Pennsylvania versus Mims says you got to get out of the car for officer safety.
Right, but for my safety, can I also drag your passenger out of the car?
Absolutely. Arizona versus Johnson, 2009, says that you got to get out of the car, again, as the passenger for officer safety.
Oh, I love it, love it. But I want to no-knock raid you. Can I do that for officer safety?
An extension of Terry versus Ohio, Wilson versus Arkansas. They can no-knock raid you, but they have to knock unless they're afraid for officer safety.
Actually, what I really want to do is just shoot you in the back of the head. Can I do that?
Yes. Tennessee versus Garner right here. Police cannot shoot you in the back of the head unless they're in fear for their lives as you run away.
I'm always in fear of my life.
You hear me rallying about Terry v. Ohio, but how come? Why? Why would I care about Terry v. Ohio? Because Terry v. Ohio creates our prison industry. You see Terry v. Ohio right here in 1968? Well, look, there was even a little dip in the prison industry because of the 64 Civil Rights Act that said police could not discriminate against someone based on race. A little dip in the prison industry. Terry, what it does is it removes your probable cause standard for being arrested. The Supreme Court's formed in 1789 and it upholds the first 10 amendments. And it says that you cannot be arrested unless there's probable cause. Probable cause is where you created a victim. I have got out of my cabin, got on my horse, went down to the police bureau and filed a grievance against you. Beat my wife, smacked my child, killed my dog. You've created a victim. I'm mad at you. Sworn by oath or affirmation. You're only supposed to be arrested if you create a victim. Terry v. Ohio says you can get arrested for reasonable suspicion. You hear me, rap? We need to make the Supreme Court electable and break it up into 6 different districts. Currently, we have 9 appointed Supreme Court justices who aren't working for our civil liberties. They're working against us. They're constantly making rulings that infringe on our civil liberties. Sitz versus Michigan State Police, passed in 1990, says that we can go through a DUI checkpoint and it's a small intrusion into our civil liberties. That case was overruled by the appeals court that said it's a huge invasion into your civil liberties. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So those Supreme Court justices had to overrule the appeals court. We split up the 9 tyrants into 6 different Supreme Court districts. We elect 9 judges in each district. So at start, each different district elects 7, 7, 7, 8, 8, 8, and we split those 9 tyrants up who are appointed, who are not working for you and me and our civil liberties. How come they only hear 80 cases a year? Because they're about our rights, We got to fight together to make these guys elected, and they should have to run on a platform of liberty. You really have to understand the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. There's a very big difference between the two. Civil liberties are what are given to us from God. The Constitution is based on civil liberties. They are supreme, guaranteed by the federal government, but nothing goes before them and nothing can go above them. That's called a civil liberty. Civil rights are what the government gives us to ensure our civil liberties for minority classes. So in other words, there's not enough people to have democratic republic representation, and so the government says your civil liberties aren't being respected. The job of the Supreme Court is to ensure your civil liberties, and that's why Congress passes civil rights acts. But then the Supreme Court takes those away, and specifically against people of color. This is the fact of our history. You have to know the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. What is the functionality of our Supreme Court? We elect Congress and they write laws. We elect the president and then he signs the laws that Congress writes. The Supreme Court is the arbitrator of our civil rights. Any laws that Congress writes or the president signs, the Supreme Court then decides whether or not they're constitutional. Meaning, if any of those laws go against your civil liberties, then the Supreme Court can strike them down. But what has the Supreme Court done instead of that? They've worked against us since the beginning. Dred Scott, 1857, they say Dred Scott's not a man, he's not a human being because he's of racism. It's not the Constitution that's racist, it's the men. We have a 9th Amendment right that says we have rights that are not enumerated. We passed the 17th Amendment in 1913 to elect senators to Congress. It's time to use the 9th Amendment to elect the Supreme Court. The guardians of our civil rights, we should have a say in who they are. What is the function? The reason that all these people are legally departed is because of the Supreme Court. Because they're not elected. Clarence Thomas didn't talk for his first 10 years on the Supreme Court. How come? Because if you don't talk for 10 years and then you speak up, well, I haven't talked in 10 years. It's a power move because he knows that he's going to be there for life. Your children, millennials, Gen Z, you'll have no representation at the highest level your entire life. These people, they'll die in their positions. So how do we make them electable? We use the 9th Amendment, our unenumerated rights that belong to us. We didn't elect senators until 1913 because it was tyranny. Now we're going to use the 9th Amendment because we want to elect the Supreme Court justices. People who say that they're the arbitrators of our civil rights, we need to elect those people. They need to run on a platform, and then we need to elect them every 4 years, and every 2 years, they're up for impeachment. We need to elect the Supreme Court using the 9th Amendment. The reason that So what happens when your civil liberties are stripped away? In 1876, when Cruikshank from the Supreme Court stripped away the 14th Amendment, thousands of lynchings for decades happened because you didn't have equal protection under the law. When Terry v. Ohio passed in 1968, you were supposed to be free in your person, papers, houses, and effects. That stripped away your 4th Amendment. Over 7.5 million people have gone to prison since Terry passed. In 1919, in a case called Sinek versus United States, Charles Sinek and his wife Elizabeth, pamphlets, don't go to war, assert your rights. They were arrested and charged with treason. Their case went to the Supreme Court upheld it. And then they colluded with the media and the president to put out Oliver Wendell Holmes' message: you can't scream fire in a movie theater. Your First Amendment right is limited. It was a snow job. They sold you a bag of goods. Have you repeated that? You have, haven't you? Your First Amendment right is not limited. Don't ever, ever diminish our liberties. So what happened? You've heard of LASD death squads here in California? The billboards are all over LA. So I just put the documentary on YouTube, opened it up to public so you guys can watch it. And in the documentary, it says Terry plus Graham equals death. So what does that mean exactly? And how does that correlate with the LASD death squads here in LA? Cops are going around murdering people. So Terry gives police the right to investigate you if they're suspicious of you and walk up to you and grab you and put their hands on you. But if you walk up to me and grab me and put your hands on me, then Graham versus Connor says that objective reasonableness, police can use the amount of reasonable force that the reasonable officer on the scene determines. I swear to God, that's what it says. How can you be objective about a scene that you're the subject in? Okay, I can walk up to you, investigate you, I'm in fear for my life. That's literally from Graham versus Connor. That equals LASD death squad. Heard of LA? If you're in high school or college, I'm talking directly to you. My generation will see Terry fall. Plessy versus Ferguson was passed in 1896, made Jim Crow laws, segregation, horrid. It was overruled in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. That's 58 years. Terry v. Ohio was passed in 1968. It's 2021. That's 53 years. We're on the cusp of change. I'll be standing there when it's overruled. I won't be standing there when you make the Supreme Court electable. Pace versus Alabama was 1883, criminalized interracial relationships. 160 whites were lynched in 1884 because of that law. It wasn't overruled until the 1967 Loving versus Virginia. You want to hear something really sick, how bad the Supreme Court is? Reese versus United States wasn't overruled till the 1965 Civil Rights Voting Act, and then it was reinstituted. In Shelby versus Holder, your Voting Act was removed again by the Supreme Court. It's going to be you that changes it. If you're in killed by Terry versus Ohio. Eric Garner killed by Terry versus Ohio. I get choked up. Kelly Thomas killed by Terry versus Ohio. Sandra Bland killed by Terry versus Ohio. Breonna Taylor killed by Terry versus Ohio. Chinede Okobi, Chinedu Okobi. Go online and watch his video. Brandon Ellingson killed by Terry versus Ohio. Elijah McClain killed by Terry versus Ohio. Killed by so this is not the timeline that I'm showing you, is just a precursor. This is not the actual show, the actual presentation. I'm not the star of this. The star of this is Jeff Lloyd. You guys don't know who my executive producer is. I've kind of nudged you guys toward the documentary on YouTube, but that's my executive producer on there, on that documentary. And he's more passionate about this than I am. And he's a conservative Republican, and I'm not. But Jeff Lloyd, he's gonna come in on the next one in the next couple weeks, and then you're gonna meet my passionate partner. This is exciting. I'm glad the message is resonating. Let's change the world. Let's change this bullshit system.
So that means that the fact that our system is in fact not driven by the structure of the Constitution as written is an open secret. We all know it. And that makes it more justifiable and less elitist.
No, not at all. That's not true. If you're an elitist, then you don't have to be suffering from the lack of constitutional standards. Whereas if you're a commoner, hey, what's going on here?
Detainment.
Oh, I see. So the constitutional standard is the Fourth Amendment that says you have to have probable cause to arrest someone. You've arrested him. Do you have probable cause?
All I need is reasonable suspicion.
Okay, so do you feel like this is a constitutional standard?
No. Shut up!
Oh, so you can be treated any way that they decide. Noah, how many times have you been on your knees, Noah? How many times have you been put in handcuffs? How many times have you been arrested and they don't tell you what's going on? And this is okay with you? This is good? You like this?
So
what Terry v. Ohio does is it puts officer safety over your civil liberties. That's what you need to understand. The detainment procedures that are really arrested, those were created by police after the Supreme Court said that they could detain us, which is really arrested, and call it for officer safety. Now, the police then created all of these policies of you have to get on your knees. It immediately enters a POW style of arrest. And the wording the Supreme Court uses is that when a cop is investigating the criminal, go on my YouTube page and listen to the Terry v. Ohio oral arguments, and you'll hear the racism. It's crazy. I tell people this and they don't do it. Go listen to the oral arguments. They don't talk with big words. It's not complicated. What Terry v. Ohio does is the police can do anything they want to you. Kill you, rape you, doesn't matter what it is, if it's in the name of officer safety. And I'm not kidding. I'm with Officer Madwin and Garrett, our volunteer. And so what's going on here, Officer Madwin?
I'm reasonably suspicious.
Okay. Is there any probable cause?
Nope.
Has he broken the law?
Nope.
Okay. So what happens because you're reasonably suspicious?
A POW style arrest that I learned in the Army.
But he hasn't done anything wrong.
Nope.
Okay. So after you're reasonably suspicious, what happens next?
Get on your belly! Get on your fucking belly! Down! 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 And then I put my boot on the back of his neck because I'm here for my life.
So we have no civil liberties if you're suspicious of us.
Correct.
Did you hear that? Has he done anything wrong yet? No. Has there been any law broken? No. This is Terry. This is what a Terry stop is. Do you like this? You think this is a good thing? It's time to overturn Terry. I'm here with Officer Madwin, and he's going to explain the difference between Kerr versus California and Wilson versus Arkansas. Tell me about Kerr.
Kerr says that I can knock on your door, announce myself as a police officer, then walk in without a warrant.
Oh, so you mean you just go bang, 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 police, 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 and then just come running in my house?
That's right, Chili.
Why?
Well, it's based on common law from the 1600s.
Common law says that police can just knock and then come running in your home. Maybe 1600s common law is dated. Tell me about Wilson versus Arkansas.
Oh, Wilson, it even gets even better, because I don't have to knock or announce myself as a cop. I can no-knock raid you, walk right into your home.
That's absolutely insane. How come you can no-knock raid me and run into my house?
Let's go back to Terry v. Ohio. It says that if I fear for my life, I can put my officer safety above your civil liberties.
So I have no Fourth Amendment right to be free in my house. I have no Fourth Amendment right to be free in my person. You can just run in and no-knock raid me.
Chili, I did it to you once. I'll do it again.
So help me understand so I can learn from you. A cop demanding I get on my knees, lay on my belly, and put me in handcuffs. There's a difference between a good cop and a bad cop doing that to me. I'm ready to learn. So help me understand. I'm not sure. I think that would be a great question for Noah Feldman, who I just posted a few minutes ago. I do know this, that the 17th Amendment that elects the senators in America, it happened in 1913. We didn't elect senators from 1607 to 1913, 1776 to 1913, meaning that the structure of the Constitution wasn't set up with the understanding that men are corrupted, and that if you give someone absolute power, it corrupts them to the core. So we didn't elect senators until 1913. And why did we start to do that? Because the people revolted. The senators had created such tyranny and things were going so poorly that they demanded that we elect senators. And if you remember, 7 years later, women got the right to vote. So I'm not sure of the answer of why we don't elect the Supreme Court, but guess what? We live in a democratic republic. It's up to us. I gotta go. I can't stay on anymore. But listen, this is not critical race theory. This is the history of our country. These are the facts of our country. I didn't want the things that I found out to be true. Tennessee versus Garner is when a young black kid was shot in the back of the head while running away from the police. He was running away. They shot him in the back of the head, and the Supreme Court said that cops can't shoot you in the back of the head unless they're afraid for their lives. You think that's fair? You think that's okay? Is it a white kid that got shot in the back of the head? Reese versus United States strips away your voting rights, lets the states create barriers to voting. Was that done for white people or against black people? It was done against black people. If you really want to know the history of our country, look up a guy named William Archibald Dunnan, D-U-N-N-I-N. That's the man who whitewashed history. William Archibald Dunnan. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Hey there, I'm Officer Maverick. Wickersham. Now, Mullen, do those words mean anything to you? Of course they don't, because you have no clue what I do. All cops are bastards. You don't know what I do. Black the blue. You don't know what I do. There have been 3 different reports and commissions that deeply entail what actually happens on a police report. 1929 comes out in 31. We've got Wickersham Commission. And then, oh, that's too old. So maybe 1972 comes out in 74. We've got the Knapp Report. Too old. 1992 comes out in 94. We have the Mullen Report. But I bet you haven't read any of them, and you won't. And if you haven't, suck it. You don't know what I do.
The number one request I'm getting is for a graphic of the wall. So I brought in an amazing DP and my buddy Garrett, who you met yesterday, and we're gonna shoot a graphic of this wall and we'll put it on the website probably by tonight or tomorrow. And what you can do is you can get the graphic. If you can't afford it, it's only gonna be $5. If you can't afford it, $5, send me the DM. Send me a DM and say that you don't have the money, and I will gladly give you a code so that you can get the wall graphic for free. Because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go down the wall and teach each one of these cases. You have. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a white actor named Dartmouth Rice who started the Jim Crow Act in 1830 and ended in 1860 when the Civil War began. However, white kids saw him get rich and famous, and so they copied the act. And where was the act done? In white neighborhoods that were all segregated. So white kids were on the street with their face painted black, putting black on their hands. And the Jim Crow Act is about slaves who are feeble-minded. They can't drink water. They miss their mouth. They said that slaves hadn't evolved all the way. They were still monkeys. This comes from Jim Crow. This comes from Jim Crow. So the Supreme Court justices, what are they affected by? Entertainment. Are you affected by movies and TV? Sure you are. So these guys saw the Jim Crow Act, and so a lot of them believed that blacks were feeble-minded and they hadn't yet evolved. They were still monkeys. I'm not kidding. This is real stuff. And so what do cops call people today? They call them clowns. That sad face of the clown is still available today. Let's talk. Jim Crow is branded when the amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th come out. And then in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the sentiment of most white people, not a few, the majority of white people, believed that blacks had not yet evolved and they were clowns. And so, of course, Homer Plessy can't ride in a white train car because he's a clown. He's got to go to the black train car. So they call them Jim Crow laws at Plessy versus Ferguson because they're going to separate the clowns from the whites. That's the reason why it's called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow meaning we're separating clowns from white people. And this sentiment takes over and keeps going and it's still, these Supreme Court justices are affected by the Jim Crow Act all the way until the 1960s and 70s. Jim Crow means 1,000 black babies dying in a hospital compared to every one white baby. That's what Jim Crow laws mean. Jim Crow is brand. You're hearing a lot about voting rights in the media right now. Let me explain to you exactly how this happened. So your 15th Amendment passes that gives blacks the right to vote in America. Well, in 1876, they're taken away in Reese. And this says states can create barriers to voting. I've already told you this. And then Giles versus Harris and Giles versus Teasley is where Jackson Giles sued the Alabama State Registrar's Office, and Harris and Teasley were 2 registrars. He was funded by Booker T. Washington, who is historically known as an Uncle Tom, but he did fund Jackson Giles to do these lawsuits, and Jackson Giles lost. And this was upheld all the way until 1965. And then in 2014, I believe it was, in Shelby versus Holder, that's where Shelby County, Alabama, and Eric Holder, they sued Eric Holder so that they didn't have to have a federal decree to oversee their elections, and they just removed it. So that's why Alabama and all the southern states are putting in barriers to voting now. You're hearing a lot about voting rights in the media right now. Let me explain to you exactly how this happened. So your 15th Amendment passes that gives blacks the right to vote in America. Well, in 1876, they're taken away in Reese, and this says states can create barriers to voting. I've already told you this. And then Giles versus Harris and Giles versus Teasley is where Jackson Giles sued the Alabama State Registrar's Office, and Harris and Teasley were two registrars. He was funded by Booker T. Washington, who is historically known as an Uncle Tom, but he did fund Jackson Giles to do these lawsuits, and Jackson Giles lost. And this was upheld all the way until 1965. And then in 2014, I believe it was, in Shelby versus Holder, that's where Shelby County, Alabama, and Eric Holder. Okay. When the Supreme Court makes an unjust and unconstitutional law and a cop is involved, it lasts forever and then it then applies to all of us. In Bad Elk versus United States, John Bad Elk rightfully resists a warrantless arrest, and common law states that you can resist an unlawful arrest, and the Supreme Court says we know that, but we're still going to charge him with manslaughter. John Bad Elk dies in jail. It applies to all of us. You can never resist police because of a 1900 case called Bad Elk versus United States. Buck versus Bell. Carrie Bell is sterilized. They say she's feeble-minded. And that's where the famous saying says that better to spare 3 generations than a lifetime of imbeciles and to sterilize her. It lasts today. Johnson versus Glick. The prison guards beat up Australia Johnson, put him in the hospital, and the Supreme Court says that's not a 1983, which is called a civil rights violation. And now, if you're beaten up in prison by the guards, it's almost impossible to get a 1983. Terry v. Ohio. John McFadden's a super cop. He can predict crime, he says. Now all cops can predict crime. They think if you're about to commit a crime, they can detain you. And what he do? He grabbed John Terry. Now all cops can grab you. It applies to all of us. Atwater versus City of Lago Vista. The woman's arrested for not wearing a seatbelt. If that had been televised on TV and that case had been going on, those judges would have been impeached immediately. You can be arrested now for absolutely anything. When they make unjust, unconstitutional laws, it then applies to all of us. To understand why things happen the way they do, you have to understand what's called conceptual analysis. Thank you, Jeffrey Kaplan. Conceptual analysis shows you what was really going on and why something happened the way it did. So Terry v. Ohio passes June 10th of 1968. But go back just 4 days before that, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And then between that, the Orangeburg massacre in Florida, or South Carolina, excuse me, and then in April of 68, you had MLK Jr. assassinated. So all these people being killed. Then after June 10th, 1968, when Terry's passed, gun legislation passes through Congress, which is in October of 1968. That makes it so cops can walk up and grab people. Who are they grabbing? Terry, June 10th of 1968, and then in October of 68, you got gun legislation that passes. So now cops can walk up to you and just grab you. In 71, Nixon declares war on drugs. John Erkelman in a Harper Bazaar magazine in the 90s would say that the reason Nixon declared war on drugs was so that he could take down hippies and blacks because he couldn't control either group. That's why he declared war on drugs. And then later on, in 1979, the FBI would establish the Plainview Doctrine. You'd never heard of that before a 1970, in Coolidge versus New Hampshire, in 1972. I don't know if that date's right. Fact check me on that, please. In Coolidge versus New Hampshire, where then if they walked in and they could see it in plain sight, that's what the Supreme Court said, then it was legally binding. 79, the FBI Plainview Doctrine comes out from the Supreme Court. Terry June should truly overrule Hodges versus United States. What this case does is it says that the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished unless you're convicted of a crime. It says the 13th Amendment cannot be altered or added to. That's Hodges versus United States. I believe it's 1908. Please, again, fact check me. I don't have a photographic memory. I remember a lot of things. So Hodges versus United States, I'm recommending goes up for judicial review. And after that case is reviewed, then I recommend that we alter the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished, and omit the second line entirely. In 1908, why do you think they passed Hodges versus United States that the 13th Amendment couldn't be altered? How come you think they did that? We weren't going back to slavery. What's the other part of that? How come that is? Why is that? My favorite two questions. Why? How come? I get a lot of calls to go on Clubhouse. And I'm willing to do that. I like to go on Clubhouse and talk and have conversations. I come in, I talk, and I leave. So if you want to invite me, that's great. I love to do it. However, the other day I went into Clubhouse and there was a young black woman and she was very upset. She was very mad at me and she said, "You're speaking for black people." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm speaking for liberty. I'm speaking because I was railroaded and it was racist because I'm Colombian. They said, he's Colombian. Give him a high bail." My bail was $2.5 million with no evidence against me because I was Colombian. Once I got over my ego, I started to ask myself, how come she would be so mad at white people? Okay. In 1868, in Louisiana, 1,000 black people are lynched because they want to vote. In 1870, they get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. In 1870, they also passed something called the Enforcement Act because 1,000 blacks are lynched to get the right to vote. So they passed not only the 15th Amendment, but they also passed the Enforcement Act of 1870. It says the Ku Klux Klan cannot kill black people because they want to vote. In 1873, the Ku Klux Klan kills 150 black people because they voted in Louisiana. Colfax Massacre. In 1876, those men are tried not for killing those people, but from prohibiting them from voting by killing them. They're not charged with murder. They're charged with violating the 1870 Enforcement Act. They're found not guilty. How long have you been silent? How long have you been silent? How long have you been silent? That's why she's mad. How long have you seen this going on where officer safety is more important than your civil liberties and not said anything? That's why she's mad. I'll see you guys on Clubhouse. When all the firearms rulings and restrictions are based on racism, that's what I have a problem with when my civil liberties are reduced because of racism. I mean, that's just a fact. If any of my civil liberties are reduced, in Sinek versus United States, that's where they reduced my First Amendment right because someone was advocating peace and not to go to war, to buck the government and not go to war. And so yeah, now I want to create pamphlets and hand them out and say, assert your rights, don't go to war. So as far as gun legislation, all gun legislation is based on race. And so because of that, specifically because of that, this government has no right to take away our rights, our civil liberties. They're given to us by God. So we have to come together on that, on all of our civil liberties. When all the Corrigan versus Buckley created racial restricted covenants where white people weren't legally allowed to sell their house to black people. Corrigan versus Buckley was overruled in 1948 in a case called Shelley versus Kramer. In 1968, the Civil Rights Act passed, which had to do with ending redlining. Redlining had 4 colors. Green lining, which was all white. Blue lining was some black in there. Yellow lining was neighborhoods decreasing badly, lots of black people. Red lining was full of black people. I laugh because it's uncomfortable, but it's true. And now, after the 1968 Civil Rights Act, black people have no more problem in housing in America. Let's get super hyper specific when you talk about checks and balances. We know about the 3 police commissions, that police are completely lawless, that they're ineffective, that they desperately need real, actual oversight, checks and balances. It doesn't happen. It still has not happened. So when we get specific about checks and balances, let's talk about what those 2 new agencies would look like. This agency is the body cam agency. They get all the body cam from the police and they have on-site auditors. They live in these guys' ear and they see what they see through the body cam. There's a heart rate monitor attached that goes to every TV on this floor. So Alex Johnson has a TV on every floor here. His heart rate goes over 120, 100 beats a minute. The TV's on here and it flashes red. That means there's multiple people looking at Alex Johnson at one time. Checks and balances on top of checks and balances. That's Montesquieu's idea. That's not my idea. What is this other agency? They also, what they do is they oversee warrants and they can approve of police investigating people. We don't need police investigating people for jaywalking. We don't need it. Leave that person alone. We need to leave people alone. This agency would have a lot of power, subpoena power, and could pull police off of people if they were beaten on them. On-site auditors, because thousands of police have planted drugs. You think it's just 1 or 2? We know about the serial ones, but there's lots. We need an on-site auditor, approve of warrants, film, record police, get all their body cam data, and create a transparency agency within this agency. The third agency in police.
What makes you think that any one of us could ever make the Supreme Court electable?
Ever, right? You say
Ever.
Ever. So in 1913, we didn't elect senators. They eventually were elected by the 17th Amendment. That's just over 100 years ago. And they weren't elected from 1776 until 1913. And he's saying the word ever, right? Ever? If you'd asked someone in 1920 to 1933 during Prohibition if alcohol would ever be legalized, they would have said,
No way.
never, 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 it's never going to happen, right? So that's how you feel, right? You feel like it's never going to happen. It'll only happen if we all get together and have one message that we need to make the Supreme Court electable, overturn Terry, and get checks and balances on policing. And you're never going to say never, ever, ever, ever.
What makes you...
I'm with a cop here and we're talking about Graham versus Connor, and I'm explaining to him that this is a dated model.
Why? Why do you think that?
Because Graham versus Connor makes it so the cops got to make split-second decisions, and that's your life in that split second.
So I'm on a job and I have to make split-second decisions. Who should be making those decisions?
You shouldn't make any split-second decisions. Film it. Let's say you go to a domestic violence and some guy's literally attacking his wife. What should you do?
Well, I need to stop him
No.
from hitting her.
No. Protect the victim and film him.
I mean, I'm happy to film him.
Right. Protect the victim. Do you see
Okay,
what I'm
yeah,
saying?
protect the victim.
Protect the victim. And then film him, don't fight him, and show it to the judge. Nobody wants barbarians on the streets.
It's true. I mean, that's not why I'm here. You know,
No.
I'm here to pick him up and stop him. So
And should you get hurt?
I don't think so.
Exactly. Film them, don't fight them. Graham versus Connor's an outdated model of policing. Time for change. I'm with a cop. Hey, you're hurting him! Dude, listen to me. I'm undercover police, guys. Back off. Back off. You heard me? Copper, come help!